Glenn was a lonely loser who becomes a doctor because he's good with his hands. However, everything changes when he discovers all his patients are crazy monster girls who are obsessed with and want after-hours treatment. It all started years ago, when humans and monsters waged a gruesome war that lasted so long that everyone forgot what they were fighting about and decided to help each other instead. Today, Glenn is in his clinic, helping a cowgirl by performing a squeeze test on her milkers. When she makes happy sounds, he tells her to keep it down, so he can complete his work. Once he's done, he wipes down his 2 fingers and happily tells her she's definitely pregnant after that. On hearing this, her bull husband runs in from the other room to celebrate with his wife because he thinks he's the father. After they leave, Glenn's colleague, Safi, jealously complains about the soundtrack she heard coming from his office earlier, but Glenn apologizes that he was too locked in to notice she was that loud. Just then, a centaur shows up with a letter inviting Glenn to an arena in the city. Shortly after, Glenn and Safi arrive at the arena, where a guard welcomes them and tells them to do their best for the princess. While Glenn and Safi wonder what he meant, Thysalia shows up alongside other third-rank fighters and introduces herself. Suddenly, some of the other fighters berate Glenn for being a pocket-sized human doctor, but Thysalia shuts them up and announces he'll be examining them. After, they head into the tent and Thysalia starts undressing for her examination. As Glenn places his tool on her chest, Thysalia starts explaining that she's looking for a young single doctor to marry. Almost immediately, Safi joins Glenn to assist and subtly points out that Glenn won't be ready for marriage, hoping to scare Thysalia off. When Glenn finishes with everyone, Thysalia's attendants Kay and Lorna approach him to ask about his findings on Thysalia's health status. In response, Glenn says she appears fine and asks if they have any concerns. Kay and Lorna then reveal that Thysalia has been on a losing streak lately, despite her rigorous training. Later, at night, Safi finds Glenn awake and asks if he's battling his demons as usual. Glenn reveals that Thysalia just lost another fight that night. Safi says she probably spends training time gooning. While Glenn thinks about it, Safi leaves to get him some booze, and when she returns, she asks if he's figured it out. Glenn then asks her to go with him to the arena the next day to see Thysalia, but Safi wraps her tail around him and asks if he's trying to take her along to see his side piece. While Glenn tries to explain that it's not what she thinks, Safi squeezes him tight with her tail and says she won't tolerate any rivals. The next day, Thysalia loses another match at the arena, so she decides to train harder. However, Glenn shows up and reveals that she's losing because of her unbalanced hooves. When he suggests trimming the hooves, Thysalia says she can't allow him to desecrate any part of her body. Suddenly, Kay and Lorna grab her and apologize in advance as some servants bring in the equipment. Glenn then gets to work while she begs him to go easy on her even though she's making happy noises. When Thysalia starts struggling to break free, Safi joins the session by wrapping around her and giving Thysalia something to gag on until Glenn is done. The next day, while Thysalia defeats her third opponent on a winning streak, Glenn and Safi watch from the audience and chat about how impressive their work turned out. Years ago, during the war, Glenn's family took Safi in as a bargaining chip between his father and Safi's father to prevent betrayal. Since they're in business together, fortunately, the contract went as planned, and after the war ended, they had to return Safi to her home. But this left Glenn with his first heartbreak. Years later, Glenn enrolled at an academy to study monster medicine, where he ran into Safi again. Back in real time, Glenn and Safi ride on a boat to get supplies, where she reveals that direct sunlight damages the skin and eyes of her kind. When Glenn asks if she could ever be fully nocturnal, Safi says she can't and thanks Glenn for looking out for her. Shortly after, Glenn clarifies that they're getting purified water and nothing else, and Safi says she's aware. However, Safi informs the captain of their boat to head to a gift shop, surprising Glenn, who then asks if she now needs a translator. As their boat sails through Marrow waterways, which is a place created for the optimal coexistence of all races, Safi commends the city council representative. Afterwards, they got the supplies and moved on to the gift shop where Safi does her shopping. When they leave, Safi comments that the greatest gift of all was that she got to go shopping with Glenn at the waterways. Suddenly, Safi points out that there aren't many boats around, so the captain explains that there's a mermaid show coming up that night, and since it started recently, it's a popular show. However, Glenn says they've got work to do and suggests that they go home. Suddenly, a mermaid named Lulala mistakes them for a couple and calls out to them from her boat to patronize her. While Lulala hypes them up, the boat captain suggests they stop by, since the mermaid is a good girl. When Glenn complains about this, Safi says it won't hurt to stop by for a while. Just then, Lulala welcomes them to her shop, and when Safi asks what she's selling, Lulala responds by saying she sings and tells them her price. While Glenn considers this, Safi licks his ear and accuses him of staring at Lulala like a thirsty moron. Meanwhile, Lulala tells them that their love will last forever if they listen to her sing, so Glenn tries to pay her to sing 2 songs. However, Lala says her voice is worth more, since the Lady Draconess approached her to make an offer for her to sing at the Central Council Hall. After she accuses them of trying to rip her off, Glenn offers to give her a free examination. Hearing this, Lala wonders who they are, and Safi explains that they're from the clinic and adds that Glenn is a doctor who specializes in monsters. Shortly after, Lala serenades them with her voice, but she suddenly starts coughing and apologizes. She then offers to start over, but Glenn stops her and says he'll examine her as promised. He then suggested they head to a secluded area. On getting there, Lala complains that she doesn't have any money, but Glenn assures her that it's free. After this, he examines her mouth and notices some inflammation, so he says he'd like to examine her chest. On hearing this, Lala freaks out and says she's reserving them for the right person. Safi then tells Glenn to work on his wording, so Glenn says he just wants to check her breathing. After Lala agrees to this, Glenn realizes her breathing is fine, so he checks out her gills while Safi asks her if it hurts. When Lala says it only feels hot, Glenn promises to be done in a second and buries his hands deep in her gills, making her scream. He then realizes that her gills are dry because she's been exposing them to air. When he's done fiddling with her gills and making her scream, Glenn asks Lala how long she spends on land daily, and when she responds, saying she spends most of her day on land, Glenn points out that although mermaids can live on both land and water, they're water-based monsters. When he says it's too dangerous for her to keep that up, he asks why she does that. Lala responds, saying it's because she's broke since her dad left for the milk store, leaving her mom to cater for her and 4 siblings. When she reveals that she has no other choice but to make money at the waterways with her voice, she suddenly starts coughing again and says she'll be able to earn a salary if she can sing at the Central Council Hall, but till then, she'll have to keep hustling at the waterways. Just when Glenn explains that her gills are inflamed, they hear a loud scream from someone who falls in the stream, and when Glenn asks the boat captain to help, he responds, saying the boat will be washed away. Suddenly, Lala jumps into the water and brings back the boy seconds later. Quickly, Glenn gets to work and tries to resuscitate the boy, but unknown to them, Lala passes out and falls back into the water. Shortly after, the boy comes alive, and just then, they realize Lala is gone. So, Glenn dives in, since he knows that she won't be able to breathe underwater because of her inflamed gills. While Lala slowly fades, Glenn grabs her and blows some air into her mouth to clear her gills. However, he soon runs out of air and fades out too. Suddenly, Safi whips them both out of the water with her tail, and while Glenn thanks her, she tells him to stop thinking with his sausage. Glenn then asks Lala if she's hurt, and when she confirms that she's not, Safi asks why they're still in each other's arms, so Glenn quickly puts some space between them. Some days later, Lala starts singing at the Central Council Hall and is surprised to see Glenn and Safi after her performance. When Glenn asks if she's been using her moisturizer, Lala says it's been helping her a lot. She then promises not to cause him more trouble, surprising Glenn, who then asks what she's talking about. However, when Lala says it's nothing, Safi blames him for making her heart flutter with his mouth-to-mouth skills. Lala then thanks Glenn and suddenly swims away, making Glenn wonder if she now hates him. Some days later, after Glenn treats a slime girl in a tub, Skady, the city council representative, walks in, surprising them. Since the end of the war, the city of Lindworm has developed and prospered under Skady's leadership. So Glenn asks why she's visiting, and she mutters some words while her human mouthpiece, Kunai, steps in to ask if they're at the clinic. When Glenn confirms that they are, she introduces herself as Skady's mouthpiece and guard. Just then, Safi whispers to Glenn, telling him she's heard rumors about Kunai's excessive devotion to Skady. Suddenly, Skady shuts her up and says that her bodyguard has lost an arm during a fight with bandits. She then adds that they're uncertain of where the arm is, so she'd like to locate it and reattach it. Curious, Glenn asks if there was a battle, and Skady clarifies that Kunai successfully chased down some slavers they've been pursuing. When she adds that Kunai single-handedly took on 10 of them and retreated, but she dropped her arm somewhere. Glenn then asks why they came to his clinic when Skady is close to Dr. Cthulhu, his mentor, who runs the central hospital. In response, Skady says she's been to the central hospital, but Cthulhu referred her to him. So Glenn asks Kunai what kind of monster she is, since she doesn't look completely like a zombie or ghoul. Skady then explains that Kunai is a flesh golem made from parts of human corpses, an experiment of a doctor with many qualificators in mad science. While Glenn marvels at this, Skady reveals that it's why Kunai hates doctors. After Skady leaves, Kunai rejects Glenn's help, and Safi comments that she's aggressive even though she looks like a puppy. When Kunai says she can hear them, Safi explains that, being a golem, she's out of Glenn's expertise. She then announces that they can only conduct scientific examinations and asks if she's cool with that. In response, Kunai says that all Skady wanted was for them to stitch her arm back, but she adds that she doesn't need their help. After stating that she'll find the arm and reattach it by herself, Kunai heads out and apologizes for wasting their time. On stepping out, she spots a hooded person amidst the crowd and goes after them. Meanwhile, Glenn packs some supplies in a bag while commenting that the doctors who created Kunai are nutjobs. When he's done packing, Safi asks if he knows where to look, and Glenn says he'll look everywhere. In the city, Kunai ends up in an alley after trailing the hooded fellow, and just when she thinks she has lost them, the bandit attacks her. Afterwards, Glenn realizes he has no information about where the fight took place and suddenly hears someone scream. On getting to the scene, he finds Tessalia, who then points him to Kunai's leg in the streets. So, Glenn picks up the leg, and after examining it, he concludes it must have been ripped due to a strong impact. Surprised, Tessalia says it's a murder and suggests they call the patrols, but Glenn says it's just Kunai's leg. Somewhere else, Kunai crawls along the alley without her leg and decides to find the bandits so that she'll be able to face Scotty again. While she wonders what to do, she suddenly feels someone fiddling with her missing leg, making happy noises while he touches her hot spots. Meanwhile, Tessalia tells Glenn that Kunai is a former fighter with an unbeaten streak. Because of this, she was appointed as Scotty's bodyguard. She then adds that it's hard to believe that she was defeated so easily, but Glenn says she might have been caught off guard since she's missing one arm. Curious, Tessalia asks how he's so calm while handling Kunai's leg, and Glenn responds, saying he handled so many body parts during his academy days. Amused by the way he handles the poor lady's leg, Tessalia calls him a man of culture. Back at the alley, Kunai figures it must be Glenn fiddling with her leg, wonders how she could feel it when the leg is completely separated from her. Suddenly, the spirits of the corpses that make up her body start chatting, but Kunai manages to shut them up. Later, while Glenn looks around for Kunai, Lulala suddenly pops out of a stream beside him and asks if it's true that he's gathering body parts for some crazy experiment. In response, Glenn says it's his patient's leg, and after saying she's aware, Lulala says she's got something for him and pulls Kunai's missing arm out of the water. Afterwards, while Glenn cleans up the arm, he wonders how he'll find Kunai, and Lulala suggests he ask the parts. Just then, Glenn asks the arm where Kunai is, and it points in a direction. At the alley, while Kunai berates Glenn for touching her, he arrives and says he's been looking for her everywhere. After this, he announces that he found her arm and leg, and as he prepares to stitch them back, Kunai says she doesn't need his help. However, Glenn ignores this and sets up his equipment, but when Kunai spots the setup, she asks what he plans to do. In response, Glenn explains that seeing her old stitches made him realize that the doctor who created her would fare better at welding. When he talks about patching her up the right way, Kunai tells him to just stitch up her muscles and get it over with. However, Glenn insists on stitching her up properly, so he gets to work, while Kunai watches, surprised. While he stitches her up, Kunai reveals she doesn't feel pain, and because of that, her name means no suffering. So she tells him that he doesn't need to go easy on her. However, Glenn says she looks like she's suffering in chips and that it's his job as a doctor to ease her suffering. After this, Kunai says she never knew that doctors like him existed, and Glenn confirms that he's a part of the minority. When he finishes with the arm, Kunai says it feels better than it's ever been. Glenn then says he'll be starting the leg, making Kunai feel embarrassed. Meanwhile, at the clinic, Arania, one of Safi's drinking buddies, shows up looking for Glenn, but when Safi says he's busy, Arania reminds her that she brought a gift just to see him. However, Safi says she didn't ask for it, so before leaving, Arania tells Safi that Glenn might be cheating on her somewhere, annoying her so badly that she slams the table. In the alley, while Glenn wraps up, Kunai makes happy noises and tells him to finish quickly, but since Glenn doesn't respond, she calls him a quack and screams louder until he's done. As they leave the alley, Kunai says she hates doctors and threatens to save his punishment for later. After thanking him, she walks off, leaving Glenn, who's unaware that some bandits are watching from the shadows. On getting home, Glenn finds Safi in a dress as she announces that she's pregnant. Surprised, Glenn says it's impossible, since her kind is on the no-fly list for anything warmer than a pillow. Curious, Glenn then decides to check it out, but Safi raises her dress, and he realizes he's being pranked. Afterwards, Safi opens up the gift box from her drinking buddy and shows Glenn an egg in it. On shaking the egg, Glenn says it's unfertilized and states that a harpy must have just ovulated. Suddenly, Safi senses a group of people approaching the house, so they quickly put out the light. Just then, the leader of the attackers orders his men to attack, and when they break into the house, Safi takes out one of them with her tail, surprising the others. On checking the house, they realize it's empty. Meanwhile, Glenn and Safi flee the house, and on the run, he asks who the attackers are. But Safi reveals that the attackers must have seen him with Kunai and assumes he's working with her. On hearing this, Glenn says they must be the slavers chasing Kunai, and Safi chips in that they might be planning to take him hostage. After saying she won't allow that, Glenn suggests they head to the Central Council and explain everything to Kunai. Surprisingly, Kunai shows up carrying a bandit's body and tells them she took care of the slavers. When she drops the body, Glenn examines it while she explains that the slavers have been illegally trafficking harpies and forcing them to lay eggs, which they sell to the folks on Epstein Island. Just then, Glenn shows Kunai the egg and asks if it belongs to the same harpies. In response, Kunai says it is and adds that the slavers will come after them. On hearing this, Safi asks Kunai to protect them, but she suddenly draws her sword and takes out an attacker behind her while saying it's impossible. After this, she tells Glenn and Safi to follow her to the waterways. On the way, she explains that they're safer with her, and suddenly, Lala pops out of a stream nearby and waves at them. Surprised, Glenn asks what she's doing there, and Kunai says she'll explain. Shortly after, they join Scotty on a boat, and Lala takes a dive, pulling the boat as she swims. Some moments later, Safi asks Scotty why Lala is pulling the boat, and in response, Scotty says it's part of their deal. She then further explains that in exchange for singing at the Central Council, she'll be helping them out with missions. Hearing this, Glenn accuses Scotty of taking advantage of Lala, but Kunai retorts, telling him to know his place. However, Glenn shuts her up and faces Scotty for answers. Glenn then admits to this, while stating that Lala was perfect for the job and that she's well rewarded, while Glenn explains that, as her doctor, he can't allow Lala to endanger herself on such missions. Lala surfaces and says she's old enough to make decisions for herself. When she adds that Scotty said she could swim away if things get dangerous, Glenn agrees to mind his business. Afterwards, Lala announces that they're close to the hideout, but some archers suddenly line up over a bridge and shoot arrows at them. Fortunately, Kunai gets them all to duck and steps up with her sword to cut down incoming arrows. After blocking some arrows with her arm, Tesselia shows up on the bridge and says she was at the clinic to set a date for their betrothal, but found it ransacked. So she trailed the attackers and arrived at the beach. Just when she points her lance at the archers, one of them charges towards her to attack, but Kay takes him out as Lorna also joins them. Then they decide to handle the slavers while Scotty's boat sails on. On the bridge, one of the slavers tries to talk Tesselia into sparing them, since they're both mercenaries. When the slaver states that monsters and humans aren't meant to live together, Tesselia asks if he's been blind since he arrived at the city and explains how both races have gotten along pretty well. However, the slaver disagrees and suddenly charges towards her, but Tesselia stops him with her lance, startling the others. Meanwhile, the boat arrives at the hideout, and Glenn tells Lala to leave for her safety. As they prepare to head into the hideout, one of the slavers steps out and says they should have run when they had the chance. In response, Kunai guesses he must be the ringleader of the slavers. However, the guy clarifies that they're only buying and selling monster eggs. When Kunai lists all their crimes, the ringleader asks how they're expected to survive as former mercenaries when there are no wars going on. In response, Kunai says that the council could help them with jobs in construction. When she calls them criminals, the guy attacks with a sword and draws her sword to fight. As they clash swords, Kunai tells Scotty and the other to go get the girls, but as they head in, the ringleader says he has men waiting for them. Kunai then responds by saying she doesn't compare to Scotty in strength. Suddenly, Scotty charges in alongside Glenn and Safi, and an attacker suddenly tries to attack them, but Scotty swiftly knocks him into the wall with her tail. Shortly after, they find a room, and when they enter, they find harpies cuddled up in fear. Just then, Glenn tells them not to be afraid and introduces himself as a doctor from the clinic. While the harpies get excited, Glenn observes that their wings aren't getting enough oil, so they've been losing feathers. Just then, the harpies reveal that one of them, named Ellie, has been feeling pain in her belly. So Glenn puts a gag over her mouth while Safi covers her up. He then examines her abdomen under the sheets and realizes that an egg is stuck in her oviduct. He then states that they have to hurry and tells Safi and Scotty to keep watch. While he takes delivery of the egg, the bandits barge in and rush in to attack, but Safi knocks them out by swinging her tail. While she fights alongside Scotty, she thinks about the secrets she's been keeping from Glenn. Unknown to Glenn, Safi's family specializes in assassination techniques, so she was planted in Glenn's family to slay them all if the peace negotiations with the humans fail. While they take out the bandits, Safi gets stabbed with a poisoned dagger and collapses. Sometime later, she wakes up to Glenn tending to her. So she asks if he noticed how she fought, and when he confirms that he did, Safi reveals that for generations, her clan worked as assassins. In response, Glenn says he's been aware since she came to their house. He then adds that his father researched her clan before going into negotiations with them. While Safi marvels at this, Glenn reminds her of the first time she fell ill and confesses that one of the servants poisoned her food without telling them. When Glenn thanks her for always being there with him, Safi gets excited and pins him to the bed for some action. However, she collapses, so Glenn explains that the poison is not completely out of her system. Sometime later, Glenn and Safi ride in a carriage on a rocky road, and Tesselia, who's been pulling the carriage, assures them that she'll get them to their destination. While Tesselia pulls the carriage on, Safi says it's a miracle that Tesselia was also headed to the Harpies' village. At the same time, Dr. Kulthi sent them to do checkups at the village. In response, Glenn says he didn't expect it either and wonders how Ellie is doing. In response, Safi says she was taken back to the village with the other Harpies, but she has no family. To make matters worse, Ellie had lost so many feathers that she could no longer fly. Suddenly, the carriage gets stuck again, and as Tesselia struggles, she tells her attendants that it's time to show Glenn that she's just the right woman for him. Shortly after, a landslide hits the mountainside and almost takes them all out, but fortunately, Kay and Lorna protect Tesselia. Quickly, Glenn gets out to check on them, but they soon realize that Kay can't stand, and when Glenn checks her out, he says it's a sprain. Just when Tesselia starts blaming herself for this, some escorts from the Harpies' village found them, so Glenn asks for their help. Some moments later, the Harpies airlift Kay and take her to the village, and the other arrive after them. On getting to the village, they are welcomed by the elder, who then explains that they've been preparing for their arrival and suggests that Glenn examine Kay immediately. However, Tesselia says she has some important business to discuss with the elder, so Glenn, Safi, and Lorna visit Kay. And after checking the hurt leg, he confirms it's a sprain and suggests she get some bed rest. However, Kay says she can walk if her leg isn't broken. But just as she tries, Safi tells her to avoid moving too much while Glenn puts a compress on the knee. After this, Lorna assures Kay that she'll take care of Tesselia while she gets her rest. Afterwards, the villagers queue for a checkup, and while Glenn attends to them, Safi comments on how popular he's become. Suddenly, the Harpies from the bandits' hideout show up at the window, making Safi feel uneasy as they thank him for saving them. In response, Glenn says he's happy to see them doing well, but when he asks about Ellie, the Harpies won't come out, since she's too shy to see him. Later, when Glenn heads out, he spots Lorna standing by the stream and asks why she's out there by herself, but Lorna says she's there with Tesselia. Surprised, Glenn asks where Tesselia is, and Lorna suddenly realizes she's alone, so she says they must have been separated. After this, she asks about Kay, and Glenn explains that she's getting better. Curious, Glenn asks Lorna how she's related to Kay, and she explains that they're both war orphans who were taken in by servants to Tesselia's family and have served Tesselia ever since. Just then, Tia shows up and says she's been looking for Lorna everywhere and asks what she's doing there. In response, Lorna says she was asking Glenn about Kay and asks Tesselia how she got lost. In response, Tesselia points out that she's the one who got lost, since she wandered away when they were together. Later that night, Tesselia rants about Lorna's clumsiness while eating with Glenn and Safi. After telling them of how many times she's slipped up since they arrived at the village, Tesselia says she hasn't had a decent meal since then and commends Safi's cooking as she gobbles it up and asks for more. Afterwards, when Tesselia adds that Lorna kept saying unthinkable things during their meeting with the elder, Safi asks about their discussion with the elder. In response, Tesselia reveals that they discussed creating an air courier division specialized for speed and negotiated the possibility of employing Harpies for the venture. Impressed, Safi says it'll be perfect for delivering urgent medicines and messages. After this, Tesselia worries about Lorna's strange behavior and asks Glenn to check her out. In response, Glenn says that Lorna is absent-minded because she's worried about Kay and suggests they wait for Kay to get better. However, Tesselia says she'll lose her mind since she can't imagine life without her attendants, but Safi tells her to just do things herself. However, when Tesselia offers them a bottle of vintage wine, Safi gets excited and suggests they help her out immediately. While Glenn wonders what's gotten into her, Safi says they can't pass on such an offer. Glenn then says there's nothing they can do, but Tina refuses to take no for an answer and pleads with Glenn to help Lorna. Later that night, Glenn says he didn't bring medical books along to research Lorna's condition, so he brainstorms with Safi, who then points out that Lorna must be a softie at heart and suggests a method to help her. The next day, during a session with Glenn, Lorna worries about Kay and Tesselia and realizes she has to straighten up, since it's all up to her to keep things together. Just then, Glenn interrupts her thought and asks if she feels calmer. With a blindfold on, Lorna confirms that she's alright and recalls her promise to Kay to keep things together. Amused, Safi comments that the blindfold worked. After this, Glenn takes out a gag and says that if the blindfold, his methods might also prove useful. Some moments later, he ties her up like in a bondage situation and starts tugging on her ropes while she makes happy noises. Worried, Glenn asks if she's okay, but Lorna says he can make the ropes tighter. Meanwhile, Safi asks Glenn what he's doing, and he claims he's realigning her bones to improve her posture, since it's a regular practice among centaurs. Just then, Tesselia takes the gag out of Lorna's mouth and asks how she's feeling. In response, Lorna says she feels calmer and feels a weight lifted off her chest. When Safi marvels at how Glenn's methods worked, Glenn says it might be because Lorna is a sucker for ropes. Tissalia then thanks Glenn and reminds Lorna of when they consulted Glenn about her hooves. After this, she hugs Lorna and says she loves her and Kay. Curious, Safi asks Glenn if Lorna will walk around the village with a blindfold on, and Lorna says she's fine with it. Later, when Glenn tends to Kay, she says she wasn't aware of Lorna's affection for ropes, and Lorna thanks Glenn for helping her discover it. On hearing this, Kay says she hasn't thanked him for tending to her wounds, but Glenn says it's fine. Since Tissalia paid for it, when Kay says it's not enough, Lorna suddenly leans on his back, pushing him into Kay's pillows. She then says it's their way of thanking him properly, while Glenn claims that Tissa will get angry. However, the ladies say they're doing it for Tissalia, since they'll serve him also when he gets married to her. While Kay moves his hands to her hips, Glenn quickly breaks free, but the ladies claim they're just teasing him and add that they look forward to the day he becomes their master. Some days later, Glenn removes Kay's bandages, and when she thanks him, Safi wonders if they can examine Ellie and head back to Lynn Worm. However, Glenn says she's been rejecting an examination and wonders if he did something wrong. On hearing this, Tissalia says she'd like to discuss something with him. Afterwards, they head into the woods, and Tissalia confirms that Ellie has requested to see her in exchange for the examination, and when Glenn asks if they know each other, Tissalia says they don't. Shortly after, they arrive at a house and, opening the door, Glenn finds her feathers everywhere. Glenn then says he heard that she's losing her feathers and can no longer fly. After giving him a savage response, Ellie says she'd like to talk to Tissalia, but Glenn suggests they do the examination first. So, Ellie agrees, and when he examines her feathers, he realizes she was a great flyer. So he touches her feather, making her squeal while he asks if it hurts. After examining her feathers, he suddenly touches her armpits, making her scream. So he quickly takes his hands off her and explains that he was just trying to check her temperature with his accurate hands. Suddenly, Safi grabs him with her tail and reminds him that she's always told him to be gentler with young girls. After this, she slams him into a wall, while Tissalia berates her for being so violent. Afterwards, Ellie asks Glenn what kind of illness she has, and he explains that she's just growing new feathers and losing the old ones. When he says she'll be able to fly in no time if she rests and eats well, Ellie calls him a liar and says she has always flown after changing her feathers. Glenn then clarifies that she's losing more feathers than usual this time. Annoyed, Ellie says he's wrong and starts stomping the floor while calling him a quack. Just when Glenn tries to convince her more, Ellie attacks with her claws, but Tissalia blocks the attack with a broomstick. After this, Ellie angrily storms out of the room. However, Tissalia offers to handle it and heads out to join her by the stream. Surprised, Ellie asks why she came alone, and Tissalia reminds her that she made a request to talk to her. Just then, Ellie says she always goes to the arena to watch matches for free from the sky. When Ellie says she'd like to become a gladiator too, Tissalia says that the arena welcomes everyone, but clarifies that fangirling won't get her what she wants. She then picks a stick and tells Ellie to show what she's got. Excited, Ellie prepares to attack with her claw while Tissalia lectures her on gladiators' etiquette. Later that day, Glenn tends to Tissalia and asks if Ellie knows anything about combat. In response, Tissalia says she only used underhanded tricks but adds that she made sure she drums some sense into the harpy with the wooden pole. Worried, Glenn hopes he won't have to deal with the consequences of that. So, Tissalia reveals that she just wanted to put Ellie in her place because she spoke badly about Glenn. Not wanting to be left out, Safi agrees with Tissalia and says she was considering putting Ellie to sleep with some meds. Shocked, Tissalia says she's going too far, while Glenn says they can't just leave Ellie to self-destruct. Tissalia then narrates how she tried to convince Ellie to drop her gladiator dreams and stay in the village after beating her up, but Ellie says she'd rather be somewhere else. She then adds that Ellie will have to resolve whatever is plaguing her on her own and reveals that Ellie will run away again, even if she becomes a gladiator. After Glenn finishes with Tissalia, she hands him a feather she picked after the spar with Ellie because it looks really large. When Glenn explains that it's a flight feather, Tissalia says she hopes it'll help with his examination. Just then, Glenn says he'd like the ladies to help the next day and announces that he'll be conducting a treasure hunt. The next day, they go around the village picking feathers that match Ellie's, and after examining them, Glenn confirms that Ellie is just changing feathers. Tissalia then recalls that Ellie said she must belong somewhere she can find what she needs. Just when Tissalia tells Glenn that she's sure he has what it takes to help Ellie, Safi shows up, acting jealous. So Glenn clarifies that Tissalia was only boosting his confidence, making Tissalia get excited about being useful to Glenn. Unimpressed, Safi congratulates her and adds that Glenn can barely survive a day without her. So Glenn tells both ladies to chill out, and when Safi slithers away, Tissalia says she's probably tired and advises Glenn to give her some attention too. Suddenly, a harpy lands and notifies Glenn that Ellie is nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, Ellie flies to the arena to watch some gladiators fight and thinks she's ready to take over the skies. However, as she starts flying, she suddenly feels weird. So she lands on a tree and realizes she's still unable to fly for long. She then recalls Tessalia's lessons and wonders where she's supposed to go. Somewhere else in the forest, Glenn and his companions call out to Ellie. But Safi quickly scans the forest using infrared vision and finds her standing in a tree. When they locate her, she tells them to get lost since she'll never fly again. But Tessalia refuses and says she has to apologize for making everyone worry. On spotting Glenn from above, she calls him a quack again, and while Tessalia lectures her, Glenn stops her and tells Ellie that he was wrong about her diagnosis. In response, Ellie says she doesn't care what happens to her anymore. But Glenn shows her the feathers he picked from the village. This annoys Ellie, so he apologizes for picking them without her consent and says he knows why she can't fly. He then explains that it's because she's finally getting her adult feathers. In addition, he explains that her feather will soon be different from the other harpies because she has phoenix blood running through her veins. While Ellie marvels at this, Glenn assures her that she'll fly again with beautiful and fiery wings. Some days later, Ellie flaunts her newly grown flowers to Glenn and asks if she looks okay. When Glenn says more feathers will grow, Ellie gets excited and gives him a 360. Just then, Tessalia shows up and lectures her on her appearance, but Ellie is more concerned about showing everyone her colorful feathers. Glenn then asks Ellie why she acted weird when he tried to examine her, and she responds, saying it's because he's seen her lay her egg. Just when Ellie runs off, Safi joins them, and Glenn reveals that the village elder was surprised by the change in Ellie's feathers. Tessalia chips in that she has to trace her ancestry since she's an orphan. Later, Glenn and Safi prepare to leave and talk about returning to their clinic before it begins snowing. Suddenly, Ellie barges in through the window, all covered in a weird sticky fluid. Surprised, Safi asks what it is, and Ellie responds, saying she flew into it in the forest and laments about how bitter it tastes in her mouth. Just then, Glenn touches it and says it must be spider silk from an arachne. Curious, Ellie asks what that is, and Glenn explains that they're monsters with lower halves that resemble spiders. He then further explains that the silk can be washed off with warm water. Suddenly, Ellie leaps out the window, but quickly returns to ask Glenn if he'd like to join her at the hot springs. Annoyed, Safi tells her to get lost, and when she sees Glenn smiling, she threatens him to wipe the smile off his face. In his defense, Glenn says he's just glad to see a fully recovered patient, but ends up putting the silk on himself. Subsequently, more harpies show up complaining about getting the silk on themselves, and when Glenn gets tired of explaining, he decides it's time to get to the root of the problem and track down the arachne. So he heads into the forest with Safi, and shortly after, they find trails left behind by the arachne. While they continue, Glenn points out that Safi's clothes are made by arachne, and she confirms that only their kind is capable of making clothes that block light. While he marvels at their talent, Safi warns him to be careful since the arachne are the best at making traps. While Glenn assures her that he's not dumb enough to fall for that, he gets strung up by a thread, and Safi says that the trapper must be aware that someone is caught up in their trap. Suddenly, the arachne drops from above, and turns out it's Arania. Surprised to see her, Arania asks Safi what she's doing so deep in the mountains, and Safi says she and Glenn are helping out in a village nearby. Surprised, Arania introduces herself as Safi's best friend, while Safi explains that they got close when she started ordering clothes from her. When she adds that Arania is the lead designer of a company that specializes in monster apparel, Glenn introduces himself and asks Arania why she's in the forest. In response, Arania says she heard about a harpy with phoenix feathers in the mountains, surprising Glenn. When he comments that information spreads fast, Arania says she'd like to draw inspiration from the miraculous phoenix whose rainbow wings change color every time they flap them and use it in her designs. When she adds that it's why she's been setting traps to catch it, Glenn reveals that the harpy lives in the village and not in the wild. Moments later, they arrive at the village and find Ellie chilling on a roof by herself. Suddenly, Arania jumps on the roof to check out and charges towards Ellie, freaking her out. However, Ellie tells her to go away and refuses, so Arania pleads with her. Meanwhile, somewhere in the forest, Tessalia trains with her lance, and suddenly Ellie flies by while Arania chases her, casting her silk all over Tessalia. Back at the village, Safi tells Glenn that she made Arania promise to stop casting her webs all over the forest. Just then, Tessalia joins them all, covered in webs, and demands to know what's being done about it. While Tessalia crashes out, Safi states that Arania is her friend. But Tessalia tells her to get better friends and asks how they allowed someone so dangerous to run free like that. Safi then states that although Arania might lose her senses when excited, she's not dangerous. Hearing this, Tessalia then clarifies that her woman's instincts tell her that Arania can't be trusted, but Glenn chips in that Arania just wants to check out Ellie's feathers for her next design. Safi then states that regardless of what Arania does, there's no need to worry since Tessalia is around to keep them safe. While she slithers away, Tesselia tells Glenn she's probably tired since she's been working non-stop since they arrived to impress him. Surprised, Glenn says he had no idea, so Tesselia says he's a dummy even though he's a doctor. Later that night, Glenn hands Safi a cup of tea and tells her to take some time off to relax at the hot springs. When he tells her to consider it as a present from him, Safi decides to take him up on the offer. Later, while Safi relaxes at the hot spring, Arania visits the clinic and asks if Safi is around. In response, Glenn says she's not and asks what she wants, so Arania pretends to be ill, and when Glenn checks her out, he says that she seems fine. Just then, he notices her staring and asks if something is wrong. Arania then says she's heard a lot about his impressive skills from Safi. She then says she's heading out and asks Glenn to accompany her. After walking in the forest for a while, Glenn asks how far they're going, and when Arania gives an indefinite response, Glenn suggests they head back. However, Arania keeps walking deeper into the forest, so Glenn decides to head back, but as he turns, he triggers one of her traps and gets strung up. Just then, Arania takes out her scissors and prepares to get freaky with him. Just then, Glenn realizes she was fine all along as Arania explains that she's covetous and simply wants a share of what Safi enjoys. However, Glenn clarifies that they're just colleagues, but Arania ignores this and tries to kiss him. Fortunately, Tia charges in and rescues Glenn, surprising Arania, who then asks how she evaded her traps. In response, Tesselia says she cut them all with a sword and adds that she heard everything she said about clapping Glenn. Suddenly, she says she won't allow it, and when Arania tells her to stay out of it, Tesselia says that Glenn is set to court her and take over her family's empire. On hearing this, Arania says they're similar, but Tesselia disagrees, claiming she truly loves Glenn. So Arania accuses her of trying to use Glenn for her personal gain and says that makes them the same. Annoyed by this, Tesselia charges towards her, but Arania jumps onto a tree using her silk, so Tesselia crashes out to prove that she's nothing like her. Just when both ladies prepare to unalive each other, Safi suddenly grabs Glenn with her tail and tells the ladies to quit fighting over her man. Later at night, while they drink together, Glenn asks Safi if she knew that Arania was plotting something, and in response, Safi says she saw it coming. After this, she confesses her love for Glenn and laments about other rivals showing up, making Glenn choke on his drink. In response, Glenn says he doesn't know what the future holds, but reassures her that there's nobody else he'd rather share the drink with. Suddenly, the entire area gets rocked by a vibration, and when they step out, the elder narrates how legend speaks of giants known as Gigas, who destroy everything when humans refuse to sacrifice to them. Suddenly, everyone gathers outside the village, where the elders reveal that some scouts reported that a giant god is approaching the village. Just when everyone starts panicking, Tesselia steps up and declares that they need to remain calm. She then orders Ellie to fly to Lindworm and inform Scotty, and tells those who can fly to prepare to leave for Lindworm. After this, she orders Kay and Lorna to prepare the carriage and asks Arania to pack the people's belongings with her silk. Facing Glenn, she tells him to take care of the harpies that can't fly, since the carriage can carry only so many, and some of them need to descend the mountain on their own. Afterwards, everyone gets to work, and after Glenn prepares the last patient, Safi shows up and suggests they pack their belongings too. So while they pack, the village gets rocked again, and some medicines fall off the shelves. Luckily, Safi catches them all and suggests they leave immediately to avoid dealing with a giant god. While everyone evacuates the village, Glenn asks Safi if she's seen Tesselia around, but she says she hasn't. Somewhere else, Tesselia heads into the forest, wishing she had told Glenn about her plans to stall the giant god. She then decides to propose to Glenn if she survives, but just when she starts laughing at herself, Safi shows up and attacks her with her tail. Quickly, Tesselia blocks it with her lance and asks Safi what she's doing there. In response, Safi asks if she's trying to take on the giant god alone, and Tesselia says it's her job as a leader. However, Safi points out that her ears are trembling and says she's scared. Ignoring this, Tesselia says that her mind is made up, and Glenn shows up, saying that as her doctor, he can't stand by idly while she risks her life. On seeing him, Tesselia says they can't stop her because someone needs to stall the giant god. When they state that they'll be helping her, Tesselia says they might get trampled on and tells Safi to get Glenn down the mountain. However, Glenn stops them and says he'll dissuade the giant god from coming to the village. While they all decide to fight against the giant god, the area trembles again, so they head into the forest. Shortly after, they encounter a giant in the forest, and he steps forward to tell the giant that he'd like to talk. On hearing this, the giant pauses, so Glenn explains that the villagers are scared and asks if they've done anything to annoy it. Suddenly, the giant sneezes, blowing Glenn away, but Safi catches him. The giant then apologizes and says she heard that there's a doctor in the village who could examine her. Meanwhile, at Lindworm, Kun-Ai questions Ellie's claims as she repeats that the giant god is in her village. Just then, Scotty says that the giant god that lives in the mountains won't harm anyone and adds that her name is Dione. Back at the village, Glenn examines Dione using a scaffold built by the villagers, and when he tells her to open her mouth, he steps back when he realizes he could be easily swallowed. Worried, Safi tells Glenn to be careful, and he assures her he's fine. After his examination, Glenn tells Dione that she has a cold and a fever and asks when she started feeling ill. In response, Dione says it started 10 years ago, surprising Glenn, who then says it's around the time Lindworm became a city. Dione confirms this and says it's around the time when Scatty visited her. After this, Glenn says he'll prepare some medication for her, but just as he moves, he falls off the scaffold. Fortunately, he lands on Dione's bouncy castles and lands safely, but just as he tries to get back, he realizes how soft giant melons are. Suddenly, he starts slipping in between her gigantic orbs, but Dione picks him up. However, he drops again and slips into the Grand Canyon. Moments later, Gione drinks up the medicine prepared for her while Ellie asks her where she hangs out. When Dione says she hangs out at the summit, some harpies point out that it must have taken her a while to get down the mountain and add that she scared the entire village. On hearing this, Dione apologizes and says she was trying to avoid squishing any animals in the forest. Meanwhile, Safi asks Glenn if he thinks the extracts from herbs will work on Dione, and Glenn confirms that they should. Just then, the village elder approaches them and says he had no idea the giant god was so friendly. So Glenn asks if the legend was capping, and the elder says he's unsure where the legend got it wrong. Glenn then suggests that they get her bigger clothes to ensure Dione doesn't get a cold again and return to the village. Just then, Safi gets Arania, who then freaks out about making an outfit for a giant. After this, she says she can only make a hat and an apron with the materials she has. Suddenly, the harpies show up with materials for the goddess. Suddenly, Arania gets to work while Kay and Lorna decide to fix Dione's hair. Moments later, Dione tries on her outfit and is surprised at how the villagers turned up for her. Glenn then tells her to recuperate completely in the village before leaving. Some days later, Ellie shows up at Glenn's window and announces that he has a letter from the Central Council, surprising Glenn, who then asks why she's bringing it to him. Afterwards, Glenn goes on a date with Tysalia and says that he heard Ellie now works with her family's transport company as one of the Sky Messengers. On hearing this, Glenn says it's the perfect job for her since she loves to fly. He then tells Tysalia to eat as much as she wants, since all the bills are on him. While Tysalia marvels at this, Glenn commends her for almost risking her life by facing the giant god. When Tysalia gets worked up about this, Safi comments that she looks embarrassed, annoying Tysalia, who then says she's only allowed to watch their date and not interrupt. Safi then commends Tysalia for her courage, but adds that she has to ensure that Glenn doesn't fall for her charms. Amused, Tysalia tells Safi to admit defeat, but Safi says she can't lose. The next day, Glenn and Safi meet Scatty and Kunai by the waterways and thanks Scatty for inviting them to the commemoration ceremony. Just then, Glenn spots Lulu waving at him, but is surprised to see Arania. Scotty then explains that she's doing a final costume check. After this, Kunai reveals that Scatty is pleased with Glenn's work to keep everyone healthy. While he thanks her, Scatty's tail catches his attention. Afterwards, while Scatty makes her speech, she suddenly collapses on stage, making Kunai freak out. Later, while Safi and Glenn visit Cthulhu, but on entering her office, she grabs Glenn with her tentacles and starts fawning all over him. So Safi grabs her tentacles and tells her to unwrap her filthy tentacles from Glenn. Afterwards, Cthulhu thanks them for taking care of Scotty on the scene, and Glenn asks about Scotty's ailment. In response, Cthulhu explains that it's a rare illness that has spread throughout her entire body. After this, she adds that her heart is affected and can only get worse, since dragons are difficult to treat. Suddenly, she grabs one of her tentacles and bites it while saying that Scatty's condition will be difficult to treat. After this, Cthulhu states that with some rest and nourishment, Scotty will soon wake up, but adds that they'll have to get to the root of the matter to heal her. Surprised, Glenn asks why she hasn't identified the cause of the illness, but Cthulhu tells them to return to their clinic, since not much can be done unless Scatty changes her mind. Curious, Safi asks what she means, and Cthulhu reveals that Scotty has no interest in getting better. Later, Glenn stitches up Kunai's hand at the clinic, and there, she confirms that Cthulhu is respecting Scotty's wishes not to be treated. When Kunai says it should not be allowed, Glenn points out that Cooley won't treat a patient who refuses to be treated. So, Kunai says she can't stand by and watch Scotty suffer and says she's willing to defy Scotty. Kunai then asks Glenn to treat Scotty even though it means overstepping his bounds. So Glenn says he has to carry out an examination on her first. Later that day, Kungai takes Glenn and Safi to Skaty's chambers and explains that although she hasn't told Skaty about it, she won't deny an examination. At the door, Kunai says that only Glenn can proceed from there, but Safi says she's going too. However, Kunai assures her that she'll jump in if anything happens. So he heads in while both ladies place their ears on the door. On entering the room, Glenn finds Scotty staring out the window, and when he calls her, she signals to him to move closer. She then asks why he's there, and Glenn says that Kunai asked him to examine her. Hearing this, Scotty blames herself for making Kunai worried, and says that she must comply because he had enough resolve to sneak into her chambers. After this, she says she's certain that he can't cure her, but tells him to go ahead with the examination. When Scotty loosens her dress, Glenn is surprised to see her pulsating heart. While he examines it, Scotty explains that it's a malignant tumor that just resembles a heart and is slowly taking over her body. When she states that she now has 2 hearts, Glenn figures she would be dead if she were a human or a normal monster. She then explains that it's her fate, since dragons don't belong on Earth. After this, she narrates how her ancestors came down to Earth and were affected by Earth's miasma, which altered their physical forms. After this, Scotty says that much blood was shed during the war and adds that it must be the cause of her illness. However, Glenn disagrees and thinks the cause of the tumor must be trackable. When Scotty continues to say it's why she's refusing treatment, Glenn says he's still examining her, but when he touches her, she squeals and says it tickles, while Glenn figures that it'll be difficult to stitch her up after surgery. On checking her tail, Scotty freaks out. But Glenn ignores this and comments that he noticed her tail drooping during the ceremony. When he guesses that she must have been forcing herself, Scotty says she can store nutrients in her tail and adds that it droops when she's sick. She then tells Glenn that her tail is sensitive, but he apologizes and proceeds to examine her wings, making Scotty make louder happy noises. Suddenly, she starts crying, and the noise draws Kundai, who then rushes in and is shocked to see Scotty barely dressed and crying. Immediately, Safi rushes in too and asks Glenn what's taking so long while Kunai draws her knife and threatens to give Glenn the Ned Stark treatment. However, Scotty stops her and says she's heading to bed. The next day, Glenn and Safi meet with Cthulhu and request her help to carry out a surgery on Scotty. However, Cthulhu says he and Safi can handle it since they went through the trouble of examining her. Just then, Glenn explains that they'll need more hands for the surgery, and since she has her arms and tentacles, she can make it work. On hearing this, Cthulhu asks Glenn if Scotty has agreed to the surgery, and Glenn asks if she'll help if he can convince Scotty. Cthulhu then says he has no idea how difficult the surgery will be since the tumor has taken control of Scotty's veins. However, when Glenn insists, Cthulhu angrily says that it would have been done if it were possible and reveals that Scotty is refusing treatment and she's prepared to die, despite her efforts to convince her. After this, she asks Glenn if he can convince Scotty, and when he confirms that he can, Cthulhu asks why he's willing to go that far for Scotty when he's only just met her, and Glenn says he's doing it because it's what she wants the most. Overwhelmed by emotion, Cthulhu wraps around Glenn and Safi, who are quite surprised as Cthulhu comments on how they've grown since their academy days. Suddenly, her tentacles start wandering into Safi's danger zones, making her scream in excitement. After Safi spills all over the place, Cthulhu tells Glenn that they don't have enough hands even if Scotty agrees to the surgery. In response, Glenn says he'll have Safi put Scotty to sleep while someone else helps him with the surgery, but Cthulhu objects to this and says no one in the hospital is skilled enough to help him. When she points out that they'll need someone good at using threads in their hands, Glenn says he has someone who has no medical knowledge but is skilled. The next day, Glenn and Safi try to convince Arania to help them with the surgery, but she says she can't pull it off. Despite this, Glenn offers to guide her through every step of the surgery and says he'll be taking responsibility. However, Arania says that the people of the town won't stop trolling her and tells him to find someone else. Just then, Safi says she'll be allowed to stay in the clinic and cosplay as a nurse. On hearing this, Arania gets fired up and agrees to help. Some days later, Kunai tries to convince Scotty to allow the surgery, since Glenn and Cooley are quite trustworthy, but she says it's her fate and it's fine. Meanwhile, Glenn visits a workshop where some Cyclops work, but on spotting Glenn, Meme, a Cyclops lady at the workshop, freaks out and falls. However, she gets back up when she realizes it's Glenn and says that she gets scared by people with 2 eyes. After this, Meme says it's unusual for him to visit the workshop, and Glenn says he needs the boss to make something. After he asks how she's doing, Meme talks about the body pain she feels while on the job and comments on how overworked she looks. When she points out that she runs into people all the time and almost gets run over by carriages, Glenn explains that Cyclops like her have a problem with their sight. When he warns her to be careful, Meme says she knows that and bumps into a guy. Luckily, Glenn catches her and asks if she's okay, but she quickly gets away from him and ends up ripping her dress and exposing her goodies. As a reward for witnessing this, Meme slaps Glenn, leaving her palm imprinted on his face. Afterwards, Meme starts lamenting about her market value being reduced, and Glenn warns her to watch where she is going this time. Shortly after, when they meet the boss, he wonders what brings Glenn since he has delivered the month's tools. After explaining the situation, The boss accepts the job but states that he can't make any promises about the needles, since they can't be strong enough to penetrate dragon scales. Just then, the boss asks Meme if she wants to try working on the needles, but she freaks out and says she can't. She then accuses the boss of trying to set her up to be trolled if the surgery fails. Despite this, the boss tells her to stop being negative, and Glenn says he's counting on her. Back at the clinic, Arania practices her stitching skills on Kunai, who then complains that she sucks at it. In her defense, Arania says she's an amateur and adds that she regrets agreeing to it. When Safi walks in to serve water, Arania says she's tired and asks for some booze, but Safi says she'll have to remain sober for a while. Just then, Kunai says that she's still trying to convince Scotty, but she's being reluctant about the surgery. Curious, Safi asks why she's against the surgery, and Kunai narrates how much Scotty hates the long history of fighting between humans and monsters, so she gave her all to establish the city. Kunai then reveals that Scotty believes that her mission has been accomplished, but Glenn says that they have to keep persuading her and offers to go with Kunai. However, Arania says that Scotty might even shut them out more and explains that they can't just change her mind by increasing their numbers. Sometime later, Glenn and Kathuri visit the workshop to check out the prototypes for the surgical tools. Once the boss wheels them out, Kathuri picks up a blade and slices off one of her tentacles. Shen then comments that it's sharp enough to cut through dragon scale and tells the boss to mass-produce them. Just then, Glenn checks out the needles and asks what they are. In response, the boss says that Meme is still working on the needles, and she's yet to come up with something usable. He then adds that he would suggest some ideas to her, but he wants her to gain some confidence. Hearing this, Glenn says he'd like Meme to make them too and flashes back to his first major surgery. Meanwhile, Meme works hard on getting the needles right and suddenly gets fixated on a machinery movement in the workshop. Moments later, Ellie knocks on Glenn's window and informs him that Meme has collapsed at the workshop. So Glenn rushes over there and finds Meme lying unconscious on the floor. So he checks to see if she's breathing, while Safi states that her pulse is weak. To help her breathe, Glenn cuts open her shirt while the boss asks if she's sick. In response, Glenn says it could be heat stroke and suggests they take her somewhere cool. Later, Meme wakes up and wonders where she is, but when she tries to get up, Glenn puts her back to bed and tells her to get some rest. When she complains of being nauseous, Glenn rubs her head while Arania comments that Glenn must like Meme because she works hard and says she's also a hard worker, but Safi stops her. Suddenly, Meme notices her tooth cut open with her melons floating freely, so she freaks out. So Glenn explains that he had it cut open since it was an emergency. Suddenly, Meme starts throwing a tantrum, but fortunately, Arania hands her a shirt she just made. Later, Glenn checks her eyesight and tells Safi to prepare some herbs to calm her nerves while he explains that she felt tipsy from something similar to motion sickness. When he asks what she was doing when she collapsed, Safi arrives with the herbs, so Meme inhales steam from them and says she's a failure of a Cyclops who can't get anything right, but because she worked hard on the needles, she says she'd like to show them. On getting to the warship, Mehmet apologizes to her boss for making him worried, and the boss offers to do something about the needle. Just then, Glenn states that Mehmet has figured it out, and shortly after, she shows them the machinery she created to make the needles in bulk. While she geeks out in the process of its production, Mehmet bumps her airbags into Glenn, who then tells her she's too close. Immediately, Mehmet backs off, and when they all check the needles, they realize how strong they are. Afterwards, Mehmet thanks Glenn for letting her take the job, and he tells her to hold her head high and avoid bumping into things and people. Some days later, after a council meeting, Scatty rises to leave, but finds Glenn waiting to see her, so she asks if he's still trying to change her mind, and Glenn responds, saying he wants her to undergo the surgery no matter what. Later, at the clinic, Glenn helps Arania practice her stitching skill, and when he comments that she's gotten better, she gets excited and thanks him for his guidance. Meanwhile, Safi wishes a meteor would fall on them both. So to gain some attention, she calls Glenn and informs him that some files are not arranged in order, and when Glenn wonders how that happened, Safi says she'll fix it. She then reminds him that he has to head to the central hospital, and while he prepares to leave, she asks what he'll have for dinner, but he tells them to have dinner without him. After Glenn rushes out, Arania tells Safi that men will never catch on if she never tells them directly to pay more attention to her. In response, Safi says she's used to being away from Glenn since their childhood days and adds that he'll always come back home to her. Later that evening, while the ladies have dinner at a diner, Tessalia thanks Arania for her contributions in preparation for the surgery, and when Arania asks why Tessalia is there too, Safi says they're having a girls' night out and urges them to talk about whatever they like. Afterwards, Tessalia asks Safi if a connection she provided ended up being helpful, and in response, Safi says that the ingredients she provided will be enough to create something strong enough to put Scatty to sleep. After this, she reveals that one of such ingredients includes an alcohol from the East, surprising Arania, who then asks for more booze. Moments later, Tessalia asks Arania if she knows what love really is, but she spills some gibberish about them being best friends forever, so they all drink up to toast to their wasted friend. Later that night, at the clinic, Arania tries to steal a dragon scale from a drawer, but Safi catches her and comments that she was being sloppy while at it. Safi then points out that she's willing to overlook every prank she's been playing at the clinic, but she can't let her have an item she gifted Glenn. Suddenly, Arania tosses the dragon scale at her and jumps out the window, but runs into Thessalia, who then says she's been waiting for her. Safi then lands behind her and tells her to give it up. Moments later, Arania asks why they're not handing her over to the cops, and Safi says that she was aware that she's been stressed out by the preparations for the surgery and her bad habits may emerge. On hearing this, Arania admits that she's always been covetous of taking things that belong to people close to her. In response, Safi points out that Arania has been testing the bonds of their friendship since the Harpy Village events. Just then, both ladies lecture her on what a true friendship bond looks like. After this, Safi reminds her of her comments about them being best friends forever and tells her to believe in it. Moved by this, Arania starts crying and collapses. Afterwards, Thessalia asks Arania if she took the dragon scale to test Glenn too, and Arania admits that she's aware that the dragon scale is a gift from Safi to Glenn. Arania then reveals that she assumes they were merely keeping her around until the end of the surgery, and comments on how patient Glenn has been with her as though he had forgotten what she did to him. In response, Thessalia says she's surprised that Arania still doesn't trust Glenn after that, but Arania says that, unlike them, she can't trust anyone. In addition, she says she can't relax whenever she's around Glenn since she knows that he's uncomfortable around her too, but doesn't avoid her. Just then, Safi asks her some questions to find out how she feels about Glenn, and after this, Safi reveals that she's fallen for Glenn just like she and Thessalia did. Meanwhile, Glenn meets Scotty again, and she points out that he never gives up, since he keeps visiting every day. Glenn then says he's yet to achieve his goal, so Scotty requests that he lifts her up, and when he does, she explains that she's refusing the surgery because she's spent her life building a city where humans and monsters can live in peace, and since that's enough for her, she's satisfied when fate catches up with her. However, Glenn points out that she got sick while trying to achieve her goals and gave up, thinking she would die. He then reminds her that Kunai looks out for her while Kuli is busy pushing herself to the limits to ensure the surgery is successful. In addition, he states that Meme and the other blacksmiths are working all night to make tools for the surgery, while Lulala continues to sing and hopes she gets better. He then suggests that she tries to live and watch the city progress longer while announcing that it can't be fate, since her illness is curable. Hearing this, Skadia asks if it's really right for her to continue living, and when Glenn confirms this, Scatty says he has no idea how boring it is to live a long life and asks what she should do. Glenn then suggests she try some new sweets or get a sneaky link. Hearing this, Scatty says she'll take his advice, and after asking him to put her down, she agrees to go through with the surgery and says she's counting on him. Finally, the day of the surgery arrives, and with Scatty on the operating table, they all prepare to begin. Shortly after, Kthuri begins the surgery while explaining that Scotty is originally a fire dragon, and suggests that they focus on removing the tumor first, but Safi announces that Scatty's vitals have rapidly shot up. Just then, they notice Scatty's insides glowing, and Kthuri announces that fire could emerge anytime from her insides, since her instincts are awake even though she's been put to sleep. Just then, Kthuri orders Safi and Arania to step back because of the heat, so Glenn suggests they reduce the heat first. However, Kthuri says they don't have time since her insides could go ablaze at any moment. Suddenly, the heat burns Kthuri's tentacles, but she and Glenn keep working. Sometime later, Scatty takes off her mask and addresses the city with her own voice. After apologizing for making them all worry, she vows to give her all to her duties and asks the citizens to support her. While they all cheer her, Kunai commends her for the magnificent speech, but says it's sad that she can't be her mouthpiece any longer. Scotty then says she's been watching the world and people from the sidelines without knowing anything about them. When she asks about Glenn, Kunai reveals that he's tending to Safi, who's under the weather. Just then, she says she headed to the clinic to show Glenn what happens when he brings a lonely little dragon out of her shell. Meanwhile, while Glenn tends to Safi at the clinic, he apologizes for pushing her too hard with the surgery, and when she doesn't respond, he suggests bringing her hot wine. Just then, he says he'd like to take a look at her mouth and tries to get her to open up. After this, he checks her mouth and finds a sore on her tongue, so he puts some honey on it. When he's done, Sappy pants and thanks him for going easy on her. After this, she points out that his face was too close to hers and covers herself up in embarrassment. So, Glenn announces that he's leaving, and when Safi tells him not to make many detours on his way back, he suggests that they have dinner together. Somewhere in the city, while Scotty and Kunai wait for their driver to fix the carriage, Glenn shows up, and Scotty quickly hugs him. She then suggests they go somewhere and calls him her big brother, surprising Glenn, who then says he has to check on a few patients. Suddenly, Kunai pulls Scotty away from him and asks why she's acting so lovey-dovey with him. In response, Scotty says that he cures her and shows him premium content for free. Seeing this, Kunai freaks out and tries to stop her, while Scotty asks Glenn if he likes what he sees. So Glenn tells her to button up, but she tells him to do it for her. Afterwards, Kunai tells Scotty that although she can do whatever she wants, she shouldn't get in the way of Glenn's work. So, Glenn apologizes and suggests they do it some other day. Just when Kunai says they'll have to wait till another carriage arrives, Meme happens to pass by and asks Glenn what's going on. So he shows her the carriage, and within minutes, Meme fixes the carriage. Just then, Scotty holds her hand and thanks her for saving her life twice. However, Meme says it's not a big deal. Just then, Scotty asks Kunai to leave them with gifts, so the carriage leaves them with 2 barrels of wine. Just then, Glenn remembers he has to leave, so he tells Meme to watch over the barrels and runs off. Meanwhile, Arania shows up at the clinic and helps Safi dress up, and suggests that they make dinner together since Glenn will be back. At the Harpies village, Dione lifts a huge boulder from a flowing stream, and when the village elder thanks her, she says they can always ask her to do little things like that. Just when the village elder offers her some fruit offering, Dione says she's had enough and shows them a heap of offerings she got earlier. Back in the city, Glenn returns to the spot where he left Meme and finds her there. So she laments about him making her go through the shame of sitting with the booze. Glenn then says he found someone to transport the barrels, so Kay and Lorna show up, pulling carriages with barrels on them. Surprised, Meme asks why there are more barrels, and Kay explains that it's a gift. Surprised, Meme asks if wine is not a common commodity in their town, but Tesselia adds that they got vegetables in addition. After the leave, Tesselia says she's happy she's being useful to Glenn, while Kay suggests that they fix a date for their engagement. However, Glenn says he's not interested in any engagements. Amused, Tesselia says he doesn't have to worry about Safi, since they're rivals who are in a battle to determine who can win his heart. Back at the clinic, Safi wonders what's taking Glenn so long and hopes no one is hitting on him again. Arania then says she'll give herself a fever if she keeps worrying since Glenn is popular. She then starts painting scenarios where Glenn is busy clapping every other lady hitting on him. Suddenly, Ellie shows up and knocks on the windows. Moments later, Ellie and some other harpies enter with fruits and say that Dione and the rest of the village wanted Glenn to have some. After this, Ellie asks if Glenn is home, but when she says he's not, she feels disappointed. Suddenly, Glenn arrives and all the ladies swarm him immediately while Safi watches in shock. She then moves them out of the way and welcomes him with a main babe energy. When Glenn asks how she's feeling, she assures him that she's doing better after he took her to Pound Town. Just then, Tesselia asks if she can come in yet, and when Glenn opens the door, the entire entrance is filled with gifts from people. Just then, Scotty and Kunai show up, surprising Glenn, who then asks why she didn't return to the council. In response, she says she came to visit him and offers him another present. To make matters worse, Meme and her folks show up with the booze and say it'll be fun drinking with everyone. Later, they all throw a party, and while everyone enjoys, Arania comments that it's a lot of work falling for someone popular and adds that she finally understands Safi's suffering. Safi then tells her that she can always give up, but Arania says her crush is just getting started. Hearing this, Tesselia announces that they now have a new rival, and when Arania wonders who it is, they follow her line of sight and realize it's Scatty. Just then, Glenn approaches Scatty to thank her, but she gives the credit to everyone around and adds that she sees the world differently after the surgery. While she thanks him for this, Safi grabs Glenn with her tail and asks Glenn why he's getting too close. She then accuses him of abandoning her when she's sick, and just when she tries to lick his cheek to show that her sore is better, Tesselia separates them. Suddenly, Scatty grabs Glenn and runs off with him, but the other ladies chase them and jump on Glenn. Which of the monster girls would you wife up if you were Glenn? Let's know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more videos like this, like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.